Welcome to the second instructional video for Mesh to Spline. In this video, we're going to be going over Mesh to Spline's Spline tab. So to begin with, let's convert this text into a spline by dropping it in as a child. And let's turn off let's get a little threshold in there so that we're outlining a little bit better. We don't see all those endguns. And under spline, first setting is reverse. So in order to see the reverse, why don't we sweep this? So inside of a sweep, we'll drag the mesh to spline, and then inside that sweep, it also needs a profile. So I shall make an end side, give it a radius of, let's say 2. And yeah, now you see that we've got the sweep going along. Inside of the sweep, there's a setting for end scale. So I could drop that to 0. And now you can see as the spline travels around any given edge, it is going to be slow. You can see right there, it starts and gets its full size and it shrinks all the way to the end when it gets actually goes up, over, down, over, up until it finally shrinks. So that's a really long edge that the edge to spline algorithm automatically detected. So real simple. Turning on reverse is just going to flip the direction of that. The start has become the end has become the start. Skipping over these spline settings, we'll hit those at the end. Let's talk about the spline type. We can reinterpret the type of spline that is being output by turning this on. If we say enable, it is now going to be applying by default a Bezier curve to everything, so everything gets really curvy. My personal favorite mode is setting it to B-spline, and that is now going to be rounding everything out. It's the best way of getting nice, clean curves on everything. So you have the ability to change the way that these are subdividing. I could change this to another really useful one is subdivided mode. And if I crank our angle all the way up, what's happening now is it's creating every distance of 5, it's creating another subdivision again and again and again and again and again. So it's a good way of getting a pretty even subdivision count everywhere. And there's all the other different modes like cubic, which is super wiggly random, and Akima, pretty similar, but overshoots in a slightly different way. So yeah, you can get some cool different styles just by changing those. Now, the more complex setup is actually this spline section here. So let's disable all those spline interpretations. And I don't think we need the sweep for this. So by default, you're going to see different settings depending on what mode you're in. If you're in edge mode, we will see that there is spline open, closed, or the hybrid open and closed. But if you go to polygon or outline mode, you're just going to see segments, and you can send it out as single, input, explode all, or as tags. So let's go over these individually. So here we are in polygon mode. We'll stay in polygon mode. Currently, it is saying segments are outputting as single. And that means if I make this editable, there is just one object. Hitting undo, let's change segments to as input. So if it's as input, currently there's just one input. There's a connect object. So if I make that editable, you see that there's still just one spline being input. But if we were to feed in a second object, let's say this landscape, if we make it editable now, you'll now see that it's returning 2 objects, and the splines take on the name of the object that was fed in. So each one is fed in individually. Next up, there is explode all. And if you say explode all, then every individual segment becomes its own spline. So let's pull the landscape back out again, because this might get a little crazy already. If this as explode all is made editable, you're now going to see we get a ton of different segments. Every single one of these is a different segment. Let me try and select one. So yeah, there's one segment, and I can pull that out. You can see how that spline was generated, and it turned into its own individual object. Very powerful, very important. And keep in mind that that will run a lot slower because it's generating a lot of objects, and Cinema likes as few objects as possible. So that's explode all. And then lastly is as tags. So let's see, we'll do this really quickly. I'll make this editable, and let's see what kind of tags we got. So I want to see if there's any reasonable tags. Yeah, that's a good tag. You see that's a front facing tag. So I'll leave that one, and let's double click, and that's the back facing tag. So I'm going to delete everything except for the front tag and the back tag. So now if we turn this on, I could say that this is limited to a selection. The selection is limited to the C1, and let's add another and say that is the C2. So you can see the front and back are being output as individual selections. So if you set that to as tags and you make it editable, it'll return 2 separate splines, one for each of those selections. Let's hit undo a bunch of times and get this back to being parametric again. Okay, cool. What I would like to do now, just to do this quickly, is let's yank that text out for a moment and feed that into a Voronoi fracture inside the MoGraph menu. Feed that into a Voronoi fracture, and you can see everything gets broken apart into all these different chunks. If we drag the Voronoi fracture into the Mesh To Spline, you're going to see that the splines get colorized the exact color of the object that is fed in. So as a additional, for instance, if I were to make a figure, we can scoot this figure over, and I would like the basic tab, set the display color to on, and that can be set to any color. Let's make it a bright purple blue color. If that gets dragged into Mesh To Spline, it will turn into blue splines. So depending on your render engine, you might be able to extract these colors and have them render exactly that color. So whatever color you feed in, that is what's going to be output as long as you are saying colorize as input. And of course, you can only see the colors if you have it deselected. Otherwise, it's of course highlighted in this bright orange. Now, I'll lock that temporarily so I can deselect it. In addition to colorizing as input, we have a couple other options. You can say none, so there'll be no color. But more fun is random, and now every single individual segment is being assigned a completely random color, and we have their own random seed here that we can randomize and get completely different layouts. And depending on your third-party renderer, of course, it could render these different colors. And we also have grayscale, which is going to output anything from black to white and every gray in between. Once again, really good for remapping inside your third-party renderer. And then we have tag to segments, which is really important for... Depends on your render engine, but if I wanted these to render, let me randomize those again. Actually, I say as input, and then right click on this. And if I wanted this to render in, say, Redshift, I'd say Redshift tags, Redshift object. And then in that tag, I have to say, unlock. In that tag, I have to say, hey, these are going to render as what? And I'll say, they render as hair. So if I open up Redshift and say, go, nothing's going to happen. And that's because if I were to make this editable, you're going to see that we have an entire hierarchy of individual splines, and the Redshift tag does not automatically filter down, and I'm not sure about the different render engines if they do or don't. So if I drag the tag into the tag to segments, then as soon as I drag that in, instantly you see all of those are now rendering directly in the render view, and that's because if I make it editable, because we dragged the tag in, tag has now been copied to every single individual child, and any update you make to this one will update to the children. So we could change the thickness here and make them super huge, so those can thicken up these hairs, or change the mode to something like capsules, and you can see how quickly that will generate and show up in your renderer. Okay, to cover the last bits, let's delete that render tag, we don't need it. Let's switch this back over to, well, let's override that so we have all of our polygons. I would like to set this back to edge mode, and inside of edge mode, you'll see some different settings inside of here. Specifically, we get a spline option. And, you know, it might be a good idea to delete these, and we'll just creating a brand new sphere primitive, immediately making it editable. I would like to be in edge mode, UM for path selection, and selection mode is set to live path. And I'll just draw out a little bit of a face here. We've got an eyeball, nose, and a big old smile. And just for fun, let's hit UL for loop and make a little halo up on the top. So you can see with this selection that we currently have, we have 3 different closed splines. We have 1, 2, 3, and then 2 open ones. We've got the nose and the mouth. Saving this as a selection, store selection. We can name it if we like. Let's set that to 1. I would like to feed this into the Mesh To Spline, remote into it as an object, hide the original sphere, and turn on a restrict selection, feeding in our new selection tag, and now we only see the face. At a glance, that looks correct. But if we were to sweep this, so I'll make a brand new sweep, and feed that sweep a end side, T for scale, scale it down, you will see that it is not returning everything. In fact, it's only returning the top halo, and not only that, it's an open spline that's not closed and being treated as a loop. So why is each of these different things happening? We can see it's returning the segments as explode all, and they're being told to be open. So if I were to make this editable, we'll see every single one of those different segments is returned as its own object. So if we change that to something like single, it's now returning everything, but those look open, the nose and mouth are correct, but that is still open, the eyeball is still open, and the halo is still open. So we need a hybrid of those two. Inside of the spline tab again, under spline, currently we're returning as open. We could set that to closed, and that will close those, but it's going to mess up the mouth and the nose. So we have a different mode, which is open and closed. So we are now returning open and closed, and the segments are returning as open and closed. However, you'll see that it's still only returning the nose and the mouth, and that is because the sweep only knows how to handle a single spline being fed into it. So if I make this editable, you'll see that there's actually two splines, an open and a closed one. So how do we make the sweep acknowledge these two separate splines? Well, we made a handy little setting here, which is the segments can return only the open ones. And then if we make a duplicate, then we can say this one only returns the closed ones. So now we have open and closed as two separate ones, because a sweep can only see a single spline at a time, and a single spline can only be open or it can only be closed. One more thing to point out is these closed splines are freaking out a little in their direction, but Mesh To Spline can help with that as well. If we were to turn off that sweep, I can make a duplicate of the Mesh To Spline, and that is now a rail spline by being the third spline inside of a sweep. Inside of the main tab, we can give a little bit of offset here. So that is now a direction and a scale for that spline to be generated. Turning the sweep back on, you see that that is now looking a little bit wonky, but in the sweep, I can say, hey, use the rail direction, but do not use the rail scale. Turning that off, you now see that all of those have the proper orientation based on the geometry that they were generated from. So that is all of the different combinations you can do inside of the spline tab. Again, the spline and segment settings are only set up this way if you are inside of edge mode. If you move into polygon or outline, those can't be open, so those modes aren't even available. Also be sure to check out the examples button here, which will open up a web page that shows a whole bunch of scene files that you can reverse engineer, dissect, and just play around with. Different examples of things you can do with Mesh To Spline. There might not be too much in the beginning, but as time goes on, there will be more and more and more, combining all the different cool Rocket Lasso spline tools. So that will wrap this video up, and I'll see you in the quick start or another tutorial or live stream in the future. Bye bye.